brass gold pasture, beaten flat by an October sun. A single tractor sits idling in the middle of it, engine older than most marriages, paint worn down to the metal, and a man in a faded flannel shirt who does not turn around. He does not turn around. Even as three black cars crest the far rise, roll down the fence line, and stop like crows deciding whether the field is dead enough to land on, a door opens. Polished shoes meet the caliche dust. A voice trained to fill any room calls across the wire. "Hey, Flannel, you the help out here?" The man keeps both hands on the wheel, says nothing. What she doesn't know, what nobody in those three cars knows, is whose ground her shoes are standing on, whose name is on the deed, and whose water runs cold beneath every acre she just called a parking lot. 5 seconds of silence. Then he reaches for the key. The morning came up over the pasture like brass left too long in the sun. Robert Williams sat on the John Deere, engine idling. His father had bought it in 1972, paid cash, drove it home 40 miles, with a hand-rolled cigarette behind his ear. The tractor was older than most of the people who would die not knowing what it was worth to a man like Robert. Which was nothing, and everything. He cut the engine. Silence settled over the field the way silence does in October. Heavy, gold-edged, the kind that smells like dry grass, and the first cold coming down out of the hill country. Then the cars, 3 of them, black, polished to a shine that had never seen caliche dust. They rolled up the far side of the fence line and stopped in a row, like crows on a wire, like Numthump deciding whether the carcass was ready. A door opened. A woman stepped out. She wore a blazer the color of slate and shoes that had cost more than the diesel in his tank. She looked at him the way a person looks at a thing they have already decided about. Already filed, already priced. "Hey, Flannel." Robert didn't turn around. "You the help out here?" He kept his hands on the wheel. The leather of the seat was cracked from 40 years of Texas sun, and he ran his thumb along the split in it, slow, the way you'd calm a horse. "That rust bucket of yours is sitting on my future parking lot." Still he didn't turn.
"So, what if I did drill it?"
"Tell your boss the grown-ups are here now." 5 seconds. She wanted the 5 seconds. He could feel it. The waiting. The little hook of it. She was the kind who had learned that silence was a weapon, and the first to feel it lost. She'd built a career on that. He'd bet the ranch on it. Except he had the ranch. And he wasn't betting it. He started the engine again. Let it sit there and rumble. Then he turned the John Deere in a slow arc and drove back toward the white frame house, unhurried, the way a man drives when he owns the ground under every tire. Behind him, the woman stood in the road, hands on her hips, waiting for a fight she'd already won, in a war she hadn't started to read. Her name was Karen Martinez. She didn't know it yet, but she had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. Dallas, that same hour, had no idea Cedar Hollow existed. Gary Young sat behind a desk the size of a kitchen table and signed a survey order for a property called Willow Bend. His pen was a fountain pen. His office was on the 43rd floor. From up there, the city looked like a thing you could buy in pieces, and over 30 years he mostly had. He capped the pen. He smiled at no one. Somewhere south of him, $400 million was waiting on a signature. And the man who held that signature was driving a tractor, older than the woman Gary had sent to get it. He didn't think about that man at all. That was the first mistake. There would be others. Morning in Cedar Hollow smelled like a griddle and wood smoke. The Dusty Bell sat on the corner of Main and Pecan, windows fogged from the inside, booths half full of men in feed caps, who had known each other since the Eisenhower administration. The coffee was bad, and the pie was honest, and the place hadn't changed a fixture since 1981. A bell rang over the door. Karen Martinez walked in like a woman who had never in her life been told to wait for a table. She took the booth by the window, set down a paper cup of coffee she'd brought from somewhere else, opened a laptop. The county appraiser was already late, and she sat there radiating the particular impatience of a person whose hourly rate could buy the building. At the far end of the counter, a man in a flannel shirt cut pancakes into squares for a small girl with a brown braid. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the voice. Her phone rang. She answered before the second ring, the way she answered everything. Closing Willow Bend inside 90 days. Yes, it's on the calendar. Her voice was warm and impatient at the same time. A voice built to take up a whole room and dare anyone to ask for it back. Tell Gary if he wants the easement language tightened, he can fly down and tighten it himself. The little girl looked up from her plate. Daddy, why's that lady talk so loud? Robert cut another square, smaller, then smaller again. Some folks use loud to cover small. Sweetheart, the second call came 3 minutes later. He could hear it leak from the receiver. Low. Silken. A voice that had learned to never raise itself because it had never once needed to. The neighboring parcel matters, Karen. Talk to the holdout. Charm him. Offer 8 figures if it gets us moving. I want the water easement clean before the bond rating clears. Karen rolled her eyes at her own coffee. Gary, it's a hick with a tractor. He'll sign for $2 million and a handshake. I'll have it on your desk by Friday. Robert set down his fork. He didn't say anything, but the muscle along his jaw went still in a way the little girl had learned to read, even if she couldn't say what it meant. Karen ended the call. Stretched her shoulders, glanced around the diner the way a buyer glances at a room she's about to gut to the studs, and her eyes caught his. 1 second. A flicker. Her mouth didn't change. Trained too well for that. But the tips of her ears went the faintest shade of pink, the color of a person whose memory had just caught up to her mouth and found it standing in the road, hands on hips, saying, "Ride it back to your trailer." She stood. She walked over. She stopped beside his booth like she'd simply decided the booth was hers now, mister. He didn't give her the name. He took a sip of coffee and looked at her over the rim. She pivoted. Smooth. The professional smile, sliding into place like a drawer closing. She'd paid a coach in Dallas $8,000 to build that smile, and on most people it worked like a key in a lock. I'd like to discuss your property line, at some point. Whenever's convenient for you. He set the cup down. Property line's been there since 1887, ma'am. Hasn't moved. She placed a card on the table. Cream stock, dark blue ink. No logo. His phone never stopped ringing, because the kind of money she represented didn't need a logo. She walked out without looking back. The little girl reached over, picked up the card, turned it upside down, and squinted at it, like the wrong side might tell her something the right side wouldn't. Robert slid it into his shirt pocket without reading it. Outside, 3 black cars pulled away, and the dust they kicked up hung in the cold air a long time after they were gone, the way a thing said in anger hangs in a room. That night he stood on the cedar porch and watched headlight crawl across the far pasture. 1, then 2, then 4 surveyors. On the Willow Bend side, moving in the dark like they had all the time in the world and every right to it. He drank his coffee black and watched. His wife had built this porch. Or designed it, anyway. Sarah used to sit out here, in the last good light of the day, with a seed catalog open on her knee, and read it the way other women read novels. She'd been gone 4 years. Some mornings he still set out 2 cups before he caught himself. He didn't catch himself tonight. He only set out 1, and drank it. And watched the lights. A man in his 60s learns a particular kind of patience. Not the patience of waiting for something good, the patience of a man who has already buried the best thing he had and knows the world will keep handing him invoices long after the only bill that mattered came due. Robert Williams had that patience. Gary Young was about to find out what it cost to bet against it. 8 the next morning, a phone rang above the Cedar Hollow hardware store. Lisa Lopez ran a 2-room law practice up a flight of stairs that groaned under anyone over $180. She'd practiced in Houston once. Big firm, glass and ambition. Then her husband got sick, and then he got better. And somewhere in the middle of that, she'd decided she'd rather know all her clients by name than bill 400 of them a year she'd never meet. The voice on the line was already mid-sentence. I need a list of holdout landowners adjacent to Willow Bend. Anyone whose signature might be needed for easement adjustment. Within the hour, Lisa reached for her notepad with one hand, coffee with the other. She gave 3 names, slowly. Spaced them out, so each one landed and registered before the next. None of them was Robert Williams. What about the parcel east of Willow Bend? Karen pressed. Old White House. The John Deere. I drove past it. Who owns that? Lisa set the coffee down. That parcel's privately held. Owner doesn't take meetings. She hung up before the woman could push. Then she sat at her desk for a full minute, staring at the wall. After that, she opened the bottom drawer of her file cabinet. Behind a row of plain manila folders sat a leather binder, soft at the spine from years of being touched and never opened. The cover read, Williams Cattle Co. Deed History, 1887 to present. She put her hand flat on it. She didn't open it. She drew her hand back, closed the drawer, sat with her hands folded, like a woman at a funeral, who hasn't decided yet whether she's allowed to cry, because she knew what was in that binder, and she knew what it would cost when somebody finally needed it. 3 miles east, behind the horse barn, Robert climbed a flight of stairs he'd built with his own hands, the spring after Sarah died. He'd needed something to build that year. Hands need work when the heart can't carry the load. So he'd put up a loft over the tack room, board by board, and lined the walls with the things a man keeps when he's stopped expecting anyone else to see them. To a stranger, it would have looked like a rancher's keepsakes. It wasn't. A framed degree, Bachelor of Science, Agricultural Economics, Texas A&M. Dean's List every semester. A black and white photograph of his great-grandfather taking a deed from a land office clerk in 1887, both men squinting into a sun that had set 130 years ago. And pinned to the largest wall, a hydrology survey, color-coded by aquifer zone, with a place marked at its dead center in red, Saddleback Springs. The blue line of the flow ran east, across Williams Land. Before it reached anywhere else on God's earth, 14,000 acres of Willow Bend drank from that water, and not one drop of it could be legally moved without a signature. His signature, without his name on a single page. The whole $400 million Enan dream was a beautiful engine with no fuel. He stood there a while, looking at the red mark, thinking about a woman in a slate blazer calling his father's tractor a parking lot. Then he picked up the phone and called a lawyer. In Austin, he'd kept on retainer for 20 years, and used maybe twice pull the easement files. Every page Young's people have filed on Willow Bend in the last 6 months. Today, he listened a moment. No, today, he hung up the man with the tractor, the hick who'd signed for $2 million. He turned off the loft light and went down the stairs in the dark, because he'd built them, and he knew where every board landed, without looking. That afternoon she came up the long gravel drive in a Range Rover. She brought wine, nuppa, $400 in a Dallas shop, and she carried it up to the porch with both hands like an offering, which in a way it was, and in a way it was a transaction, which she didn't yet know was the only language she spoke. Robert met her on the porch. He took the bottle, set it on the kitchen counter. Then he poured her a glass of well water from a pitcher in the icebox. Water, here's older than the wine, ma'am. Try it first. She gave him a look. The look of a woman humoring a man so she could get to the part where he signed. She drank, and her face shifted, clean. Faintly mineral, sweet on the back of the tongue, the way no water she'd ever paid for had tasted, the way water tastes when it's traveled 100 miles underground through rock laid down before anything walked on it. Where does this come from? Saddleback Springs. 3 miles that way. Been running. Since before there was a Texas to run in. A door creaked. The little girl came in leading an old Palomino mare by the halter. She stopped when she saw the woman standing in her kitchen. Karen Martinez had never in her life knelt down to a child. She'd built a wall between herself and that softness so high and so early. She'd half forgotten it was a wall and not a horizon. But she set the glass down, and she lowered herself onto one knee. Hi, I'm Karen. Who's your friend? This is Biscuit. She's old, so am I. Sometimes, the girl considered this with the gravity of the very young. You don't look that old. That's the nicest thing anybody's said to me all week. Robert watched from the doorway. He didn't speak, but something moved behind his eyes. Small, quick, gone before she could have caught it. If she'd been looking, which she wasn't, because she was looking at his daughter, and his daughter was looking back at her, like Karen was a puzzle worth the time. When Karen left, she paused at the open door of the Range Rover, Mr. Williams. What would it take? For you to sign an easement? He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets. To know what you mean to do with the water, she got in. She drove away and she got halfway back to the motel before she realized she'd never once, in 20 years of closing deals, been asked that question by the other side. Not how much, not when. Not what's it gonna take to make you go away. What do you mean to do with it? She didn't have an answer, and the not having scared her more than anything had scared her in a long time. The file from Austin arrived by courier that night, sealed accordion folder. Heavy, Robert carried it up to the loft and turned the pages one at a time, slow, until he reached the one Paul had marked with a yellow tab, a scanned internal memo. Dated September 14th, the signature at the bottom was Gary Young's. The subject was the engineered diversion of Saddleback. Springs flow toward a metropolitan water contract. And by the third page, that contract was worth $400 million over 15 years. And by the fourth page, it would draw the spring dry inside 7. Robert read it twice. Then he sat down in the chair. Sarah used to call his thinking chair, which was just a chair, and he folded the memo along its crease and looked at the clock on the wall. Sarah would have burned this place to the ground before she let him have it. He said it to no one. The loft didn't answer. The loft never did. But saying it out loud made it true in a way thinking it hadn't. He put the memo in the inside pocket of his flannel, next to a card he still hadn't read, and went down the stairs in the dark. The next morning, while the sky behind the live oaks went from charcoal to peach, Karen Martinez sat in room 12 of the Cedar Hollow Inn and typed 11 words into the county database she should have typed 3 days ago. Williams Cattle Co., Mesa Blanca County. The screen-filled acreage, 14,237. Last appraisal, $120,400,000. Sole owner, Robert A. Williams. She read it once. Then she read it again. Because, the first time, her eyes had slid right off the number, the way they do when the number is too big to be. About a man in a flannel shirt cutting pancakes for his daughter, $120 million. She'd called his father's tractor a parking lot. She'd told him to ride it home to his trailer. She'd offered, in her own head, in the warm certainty of the 43rd floor, $2 million and a handshake to a man who could have bought the building she worked in and left it empty way, out of spite. And it wasn't even the musana lot nudged her chest like a stone. It was the future parking lot. Her own voice. Played back. She heard it the way you hear a recording of yourself, and don't recognize it and then do, and the recognizing is the worst part. Her phone rang. Gary Young. She looked at the name on the screen. She let it ring. She watched it ring. 4 times, 5. And then she turned the phone face down on the bedspread, and she sat there in the cheap morning light of a motel room, in a town she'd never heard of a week ago, and she did not pick it up. That was the first thing she'd refused him in 4 years. It would not be the last. That same evening, Lisa Lopez drove up the long gravel road to the Williams place, with the leather binder under her arm. She and Robert sat on the porch in the blue light that comes just after sundown, when the heat lets go of the day, and the crickets haven't started yet, and the whole country holds still for a few minutes, like it's listening. She set the binder on the table between them. She didn't open it. Robert Young's already filed paperwork through a shell entity. He's trying to claim an adverse easement against the Eastern Slow Fichfronkanal. Robert poured 2 fingers of whiskey into 2 glasses. He's not gonna ask you nice. He's gonna come through the courts and the legislature both at the same time, and he's got the money to lose for years and not feel it. Robert pushed 1 glass toward her. Said nothing, and he's holding something over me. Her voice dropped, the way a voice drops when shame is the next word in the sentence. My boy, Kevin. He made associate at a firm in Dallas this spring, first in our family to do it. And Young sits on that firm's advisory board. She turned the glass in her hand without drinking it. I can't be your lawyer of record on this one, Robert. I'm sorry. I can't. Not with Kevin where he is. Robert nodded. One time. Slow? You don't need to be. You just needed to come tell me. That's enough. She finally drank. A small swallow. You don't understand what kind of man this is. No, he said. But I think I'm fixing to. The crickets started. And in the dark beyond the porch rail, 14,000 acres of somebody else's dream lay waiting on the answer to a question a woman in a slate blazer hadn't known to ask. 3 days passed, the surveyors came back twice, and Robert watched them from the loft window and didn't go down. Let them flag the Willow Bend side. Let them think the line was where they wanted it. A line drawn on the wrong side of a fence is just ink. He'd learned that from his great-grandfather, who'd learned it from a clerk in 1887 with a pen and a sun in his eyes. On the third day, Karen Martinez came back. She didn't bring wine. She didn't bring a contract or a tablet or a trifolded thing, with a signature line highlighted in yellow. She brought a manila folder she'd spent the whole night reading, line by line, in a motel room, under a lamp that flickered, her own company's draft of the Willow Bend purchase agreement. The version with her signature on page 41. She'd read it twice, in an airport 3 months ago, and signed it on the strength of a junior analyst's summary, and a reassurance from a man in Gary's office that the technical appendix was boilerplate. Standard language. Nobody reads it. Don't bother. Last night she'd bothered. And on page 28, buried in the appendix, in the gray small print no one reads it boilerplate, she'd found the clause that quietly granted the company the right to redirect surface flow from a spring she now knew the name of. She'd signed it. She hadn't read it. And the not having read it, with a different kind, was a different hop guilty than she was used to. She was a woman who read everything, who'd built herself on reading everything, who'd risen in a man's world precisely because she never once let a comma slip past her, and they'd known that. So they'd told her not to bother. His phone never stopped ringing. Because the only way to get a careful woman to miss something is to make her trust the man who tells her it isn't there. She came up the porch steps with the folder against her chest. Robert was at the kitchen table. He poured a cup of coffee and slid it across without being asked. She sat. She set the folder down. She didn't open it yet. "If I told you," she said, "that the deal I'm here to close, the deal I signed, would dry up this land inside 5 years, would you believe me?" He slid the cup the last inch toward her hand. "I'd believe you were starting to see it." The barefoot patter of small feet. Emily came in from the front room with a sugar cookie wrapped in a napkin and held it out across the table like a peace offering. She didn't know the war required. Karen took it in both hands. "Like it might break. Thank you, Emily." "You're welcome, Miss Karen." And there it was, Miss Karen. Not the buyer, not the Dallas woman. A name with a person attached, handed to her by a child who'd decided she was worth one. She held the cookie and didn't eat it, and looked at it, like the answers to a question was written on it. And her eyes were doing something they had done in front of another adult in longer than she could remember. Robert pretended not to see, which was its own kind of kindness. The kind that lets a person fall apart without an audience. After the coffee, he did something he hadn't done with another grown person in 4 years. He stood up, took a barn jacket down off the peg by the door, and held the door open for her. "Come on. Want to show you something." They walked the long way around the south pasture, past the windmill that still pumped, though nobody needed it to anymore. Past a grove of pecans Sarah had planted the year Emily was born. 8 saplings then, 8 trees now, their leaves going gold. At the top of the rise, under a single live oak older than any deed in any county office in the state, there was a piece of granite the size of a saddle, low, gray. No inscription but a name and 2 dates. A clay pot of bluebonnet seedlings sat at its foot, waiting on spring. "My wife knew this land better than I do," Robert said. He didn't look at the stone. He looked west, toward the water. "She used to say land doesn't belong to anybody. People belong to land." Young doesn't understand that. A pause. "I don't think you did either." Until this week, Karen looked down at the grass. She didn't try to answer for a long moment. "I was raised in a high-rise, Mr. Williams. My father sold leverage. He went broke twice doing it. He taught me land was just a slow stalk." Her voice caught, almost nothing, a hairline crack. "And now, I'm not sure a single thing he taught me was true." They walked back together in silence. At the side of the barn, Emily was brushing Biscuit's flank with both hands, talking to the old mare in a low-running stream of nonsense, the kind of talk children give to animals, and animals seem to understand better than the talk grown people give each other. Karen stopped at the fence and watched. Robert stopped behind her and watched her watch his daughter. The distance between two people, measured in steps and air and years of being two entirely different kinds of person, got shorter by exactly one. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved away. And the sun went down behind the live oaks, the way it had for 130 years, indifferent to the fortune at stake. The marriage of one life to a piece of ground, and the slow, dangerous business of a woman learning to want the wrong thing for the right reason. It would have been easier if it had ended there, if she'd driven back to Dallas. Told Gary the holdout wouldn't sign, washed her hands. Let the lawyers fight it out for years while she closed the next deal and the next. But the next morning, 6 men crossed the fence at 6 o'clock, white flags. On the wrong side of a line drawn in 1887, Robert had been up since 4:30. He'd been up at 4:30 every morning for 4 years, sitting on the porch with black coffee while the sky did its slow change, because the bed got wide when half of it stayed cold, and a man learns to meet the dark on his feet instead of on his back. He saw the first flag go in, then the second. He set the coffee down. He walked out, calm, unhurried. Boots stirring small puffs of caliche dust off the ground his great-grandfather had stood on. He stopped 20 feet from the survey foreman. "Gentlemen, you're on Williams land. Going to need you to pack up and step back across that fence." The foreman got on the phone. Karen arrived in 20 minutes flat. Blazer over a silk shell. New cowboy boots that hadn't yet learned the shape of her foot and were punishing her for it with every step. "Mr. Williams, my crew has authorization from Willow Bend's cellar. If your fence line's in dispute, take it up with the county." Robert said nothing for a beat. Then he took out his phone and dialed. "Sheriff Clark. Robert Williams. I've got 6 men on my property. Appreciate a deputy when you get the time." Sheriff Timothy Clark pulled up in 12 minutes in a county cruiser the color of dried mud. He stepped out, settled his hat, walked straight past Karen to where Robert stood. "Morning, Mr. Williams, sir." "What have we got?" Karen noted the "sir." She filed it. She filed everything. It was the only thing about her that hadn't changed. The sheriff turned to the surveyors. He didn't raise his voice. He'd never once needed to. Within 10 minutes, the crew had pulled their flags, loaded 2 pickups, and rolled back across the fence onto Willow Bend land, and Karen Martinez stood alone in the middle of a dirt road, in a blazer that suddenly felt like exactly the wrong armor for the country she was standing in. After they left, they get in her car. She walked to the fence, put both hands flat on the top rail. The cedar was warm from the morning sun and rough under her palms in a way that left a mark she'd find that night and not mind. Robert joined her. Slow. "Why does the sheriff call you, sir?" "Because his mama was my 3rd grade teacher, 40 years back. That's how it works out here." She didn't answer. From the porch, Emily waved. A small hand, a small smile, and Karen waved back before she'd decided to, which was the most honest thing her body had done in years. The hand moving on its own, ahead of the calculation, FPC, ahead of the angle, ahead of the woman who used to run the whole machine, from a desk on the 43rd floor. Never stopped ring. She drove back to the motel in silence. And in room 12 she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands, still smelling like cedar and well water and a child's sugar cookie, and she did not open her laptop, and she did not call Dallas, and for the first time since she was a girl, in a high-rise, watching her father lose everything for the 2nd time. Karen Martinez had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next, which terrified her, and which, though she couldn't have named it yet, was the first breath she'd taken in 20 years. The drive back to Dallas took 4 hours, and Karen Martinez spent all of them rehearsing a lie. She didn't know it was a lie yet. She thought it was a strategy. The 2 things wear the same suit, until the moment one of them looks you in the eye. She would walk into the boardroom. She would tell Gary the holdout needed handling. She would buy time. She would figure out the rest later, the way she'd always figured out the rest later, because later was a country she'd never failed to reach, except later had a fence now. And a child who said Miss Karen. And a number she couldn't unsee. His phone never stopped ringing. She turned the radio up to Thinking, and it didn't work because the thing in her chest wasn't a thought, it was a weight, and weights don't turn off with a knob. The laugh of that brand, Keller boardrooms on the 43rd floor in Glaunden and oiled walnut, with a view of downtown that had once made Karen feel she'd arrived somewhere worth arriving. That morning, the view looked smaller. She didn't know why. The city hadn't shrunk. She had a sick suspicion it was the other thing, that a person changes size, depending on what they're standing next to, and she'd spent 3 days standing next to a man who owned $120 million. Poured her well water. Instead of mentioning it, Gary Young opened the meeting by announcing a compressed timeline, 30 days to close Willow Bend. Not 90. I want the diversion application filed with the state water board, he said, and he smiled when he said it, before any noisy neighbors get litigious. Karen kept her face still. Gary, the easement isn't clean. The Williams parcel controls upstream flow. We need his signature or the whole thing collapses in due diligence. The smile didn't waver. It never wavered. That was the frightening thing about it. Karen, Williams is a sentimental man with a child and a dead wife. He'll sign for the right number, and if he doesn't... Gary stood. Buttoned one button. We have other ways. He walked around the table. And as he passed her chair, he laid a hand on her shoulder. Brief. Light. The weight of a man who has never once had to ask permission to touch a thing. The grown-ups are handling it now. Karen didn't move, because she knew that sentence. She'd used it, in this very room. On a junior analyst 8 months ago, a kid who'd raised a concern about a soil report, and gotten the grown-ups are handling it now for his trouble. And she'd watched the kid's face fold up and file itself away the way she filed everything. And she'd felt nothing. She'd used it on a contractor in Cedar Hollow 3 days ago. Different words. Same blade. Tell your boss the grown-ups are here. And now she understood where she'd gotten it. Because Gary Young had used it on her. 4 years ago. Her first week, she'd absorbed it the way a child absorbs the cadence of a parent's contempt, taken it in through the skin, before she was old enough to know it was poison, and then she'd grown up and handed it down, generation to generation, in a family tree made entirely of cruelty. She sat very still until the meeting was over. His phone never stopped ringing. Then she walked to the women's room on the 43rd floor and stood in front of the mirror for a long time, without turning the water on. The woman in the glass looked tired. The woman in the glass had calluses she couldn't see yet but would feel that night, 2 small ridges on the fleshy part of her thumbs, from gripping a cedar rail like it was the last solid thing in the state. Who taught you to talk like that? She said to the mirror. The mirror didn't answer. It didn't have to. She already knew. She took her phone out. She dialed a number in Cedar Hollow she'd written down and told herself she wouldn't use. Lisa Lopez picked up on the 3rd ring. Off the record, Karen said. What kind of man is Robert Williams? There was a pause. Exactly 3 seconds, Karen counted them, because counting was what she did when she was afraid. The kind you don't try to fool twice. The line went dead. Karen put the phone back in her bag and stood in the hallway of the 43rd floor for a moment. And then she did something she had never done in 4 years of working for Gary Young. She went home early, and she didn't pack a bag. She didn't call her assistant. She got in her car at 9 that night and pointed it south. And the Dallas Tower lights fell away, behind her one cluster at a time, and somewhere past Waxahachie, the radio gave up and went to static, and she let it, because the static suited the inside of her head. 3 hours of dark road. Then the gate. She pulled up at the Williams place at 1 in the morning. The porch light was on. She almost turned around. She sat at the gate with the engine running, and her hands on the wheel, and a voice in her head that sounded exactly like her father saying, "What are you doing? This is not a move, this is a feeling. You do not get paid for feelings." The porch light went off. And Robert Williams came out into the yard in his shirt sleeves, no jacket, the cold not seeming to touch him, and he walked to the gate and opened it and stood there holding it, not saying a word. The way a man holds a door for weather he's decided to let in. She got out of the car. She left the keys in the ignition. "I'm not here as a buyer, Mr. Williams." He looked at her a long second. The kind of look that takes inventory, not of what you're worth. "Miss Martinez?" She stepped onto the gravel, and her phone buzzed in her hand. Unknown number. She glanced down out of reflex, the reflex of a person who has never once let a message go unread. A photograph, a young man in a graduation cap and gown, the Texas A&M School of Law logo on the wall behind him, dark eyes, a nervous, proud smile. 6 words underneath. Tell your friend Lopez to stay clear, GY. Karen's hand closed around the phone. She didn't show Robert. She didn't need to. He saw the change move across her face the way you see wind cross a field. The grass going one direction all at once. He didn't ask. He only tipped his head toward the porch, and they sat there in the 2 cane-bottomed chairs until the sky went from black to the bruised gray that comes before dawn. And neither of them said much, and that was somehow the most that had ever been said to either of them by another living person in a very long time. She'd thought, watching that photograph load, that the cruelty would make Robert flinch. It didn't. That was the thing she kept circling. In the gray hour, in the cold. He'd read the change in her face, and he hadn't asked what it was. And he hadn't offered to fix it, and he hadn't told her it would be all right. He'd just sat there, present, unmoved. A man-shaped piece of the same ground that had been here since before that Texas. And she understood, somewhere around 4:30, why Gary Young's threats were going to fail. You can only threaten a man who's afraid of losing something. Robert Williams had already lost the only thing he was afraid to lose. 4 years ago. Under a live oak older than any deed. Everything after that was just weather. In the morning they drove together into town. Cedar Hollow Feed and Tack sat on the south edge. A long, low building with a wooden bin of bulk oats by the door, and a hand-lettered sign that read no credit, no exceptions, sorry, Grandma. Charles Davis had owned the store for 46 years. He was 78, lean as a fence post, and hadn't missed a day of work since his wife's funeral in 2004. He looked up when the bell jangled. He grinned at Robert. Then he looked past Robert at Karen. Slow, the way a horse trader sizes up a mare he doesn't recognize. This, the Dallas lady I've been hearing about. That's her. Charles wiped his hands on the apron at his waist. He spoke to Karen directly now. No edge in it. No cushion either, miss. Your chairman came through here in 19. Same shoes, different face. Tried to buy out our boy Robert. Robert said no. Young said he'd find another way. Karen held his eyes. She'd learned in the last 72 hours that you don't look away from these people. Looking away was a city reflex. Out here it read as a lie, Mr. Davis. Do you know what kind of way he meant? Charles smiled, very slightly, and gestured for them to follow him into the back. The back room smelled of leather oil and old paper. Charles crossed to a tall green safe bought, used from a defunct bank in San Saba in 1961. He spun the dial, opened the door, reached past a stack of sale records and pulled out a brown envelope, soft at the corners from years of handling. Inside was a photocopy of a meeting transcript. Dated June 11th, 2019. The parties were Gary Young, then a senior partner at a Dallas land acquisition firm and the deputy commissioner of the Texas General Land Office. The subject was a contingency plan, to be activated only if the Williams parcel could not be acquired through private negotiation, to pursue an eminent domain taking. On behalf of a public-private water infrastructure consortium, the transcript carried both signatures, the date stamp, and the small embossed seal of the deputy commissioner's office. My nephew worked in that office, Charles said. Made a copy of this file before they cleaned out the cabinet. The original went missing from the state archive the next year. This is the only one left. He folded his hands. They shook a little, the fine tremor of the very old, steadied by will. He passed the year after. Cancer. Left it to me. I've been waiting 7 years to give it to somebody who'd use it right. He handed the envelope to Robert. Robert handed it to Karen. Her fingers closed around it. They trembled, faintly, before she made them stop, because she understood what she was holding. This was enough. With her testimony as corroboration, this was enough to void the Willow Bend purchase. He never stopped ringing, dissolve Gary Young from the board, and crack open a federal conspiracy investigation that would eat years of his life and most of his money. This was the thing that ended a man, and she was holding it in 2 hands that had signed his payroll 3 weeks ago. Mr. Davis, her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Why give this to me? You don't know me. Charles looked at her a long moment. No, ma'am. But Robert brought you. And in 46 years of this counter, that man has never once been wrong about who he brought through that door. It was, she would think later, the single heaviest thing anyone had ever said about her. A stranger's faith, borrowed from another man's judgment, handed across a feed store counter like a loaded gun. She didn't deserve it yet. She decided, standing there, that she was going to. On the drive back, Karen didn't speak. Robert drove a 1998 Ford F-250 with one wrist on the wheel. At the second cattle guard, he eased the truck to a stop. Let the engine idle, Miss Martinez. You can give that paper back to Charles right now. Pretend you never saw it, drive to Dallas. Sign the deal. Nobody. I'd blame you. She looked down at the envelope on her lap. She didn't look up. I'd blame me. Robert nodded. One time. Put the truck back in gear, then we go to Austin Monday. It was the first time in 3 weeks of conversations that he'd used the word we. She registered it. She didn't remark on it. She turned her face to the window, where the live oaks ran past in long uneven rows, and she watched them without seeing them, and the word sat in the cab between them like a third passenger. Nobody wanted to scare off by looking at it directly. Except Gary Young was not a man who waited to be ended. The first call came that afternoon. Not to Karen, to Kevin Perez's managing partner in Dallas. The conversation was brief and entirely deniable. A word about fit. A concern about a junior associate's family connections to a parcel under litigation. A suggestion that the firm might want to evaluate whether the young man's loyalties were where they ought to be. By 5 o'clock that Friday, Kevin Perez had been called into a glass office and told, with great regret and no specifics, that the firm was moving in a different direction. He didn't understand it. He'd billed his hours. He'd kept his head down. He'd done everything his mother told him to do, and a few things she hadn't, and none of it mattered, because a man on an advisory board had said a sentence in a voice that never had to rise. He called his mother from the parking garage. He tried to keep his voice level. He almost made it, Mom. I lost the job. His phone never stopped ringing. Lisa Lopez sat down at her desk above the hardware store and put her hand over her mouth and did not let her son hear her come apart, because that was the last gift she had left to give him. When she hung up, she sat in the dark a long time. Then she opened the bottom drawer, and this time she took the binder out. She drove to the Williams place that night and put it on the kitchen table without a word. Robert looked at it, then at her. They fired Kevin, she said. Flat. The way you say a thing you've already cried out somewhere private, this afternoon. No cause. Young made a phone call and my boy lost everything he worked for. She put her hand on the leather cover. I told you I couldn't be your lawyer of record. I meant it. I still can't. But I'm done staying clear. So you take this. Williams Cattle Co., 1887 to now. Every deed. Every water right. Every page that proves this land and that spring have been one thing for 130 years, and no shell company in Dallas gets to cut them apart. Robert didn't reach for it, Lisa. He'll come for you harder if you give me this. He already took my son. Her chin came up. There was a thing in her face that hadn't been there an hour ago, the particular steel that arrives the moment a person stops having anything left to protect. There's a kind of fear that keeps you careful, and there's a kind of grief that burns the careful right out of you. Guess which one I'm working with now. She left the binder on the table. She drove home in the dark. And Robert Williams sat alone in his kitchen with 2 women's courage stacked in front of him. A leather binder and a brown envelope, a deed history and a buried crime. And for the first time since this began, he understood that he was no longer the only person standing on this line. That should have been a comfort. Mostly, it scared him, because he knew what it cost the people who stood next to a thing like this. He'd watched it cost Sarah her whole patient life. And now 2 more people he hadn't asked to fight were bleeding for his fence. And a child slept upstairs who'd already lost one parent, and the math of it kept him up until the sky went gray. Saturday, Karen came to the ranch and didn't leave. She didn't announce it. She just kept being there. At breakfast, at the fence. In the barn with Emily, learning the difference between a halter and a hackamore, and getting it wrong in ways that made the child shriek with delight. She wore jeans she'd bought at the feed store. Charles had rung them up without comment and slipped a fryband.comment and slipped found into the bag, which she'd found that night and held for a strange long minute. There were cowboy boots by the door her second morning. She didn't ask where they'd come from. She knew. She wore them. By the end of the day, they had real mud on them. And she looked at the mud that night with an expression Robert caught from the kitchen window and couldn't name. Pride? Maybe. The first pride she'd ever felt that didn't have a dollar sign in front of it. On the third morning, Emily decided to teach her a knot, 2 loops, Miss Karen. Through the back. Like a real knot. Not a city knot. What's a city knot? The kind that comes undone when you need it. Karen laughed. A clear, open laugh, head tipped back against the porch post. A laugh. Ringing. A laugh she didn't recognize coming out of her own throat because she wasn't sure she'd ever made it before. Robert watched from the kitchen window with his coffee, and he did not look away. But the war didn't stop for any of it. Sunday, the threats came faster. A man Karen didn't recognize photographed her Range Rover at the gate and drove off before she could get a plate. A reporter from the Dallas Business Press called her cell, asking about irregularities in the Willow Bend acquisition, with the specific, leading phrasing of someone who'd been fed his questions. And Charles Davis got a visit at the feed store from 2 men in a rental car who bought nothing, said little, and left a business card on the counter for a private security consulting firm with no address. Charles called Robert that night. His voice, for the first time in the whole business, was not steady. They came in, looked around. One of them asked how long I planned to keep running the place at my age. A pause, the old man breathing. Robert, I'm 78. I got a store and a dog and a wife in the ground. I've been brave about this because I had nothing to lose. But they made it clear today that nothing can always be made into something. They can shut me down, pull my supplier accounts. I won't last a season. Robert closed his eyes. Charles, I'm not saying I'll fold. I'm saying I'm scared. First time in a long time, and I needed to tell somebody before. I talked myself into being a coward in private. Robert got in the truck. He drove to town. It was near midnight and the feed store was dark. But the light was on in the apartment above it, and he climbed the stairs and sat with Charles Davis at a kitchen table not unlike his own. He didn't talk the old man out of his fear. You can't. Fear isn't an argument. He did something harder, Charles. You gave that envelope to Karen because you'd waited 7 years for the right hands. You were right. Don't let 'em make you wrong about it now. A man your age, Robert stopped. Start it over, gentler. A man who's done what you've done doesn't get to decide his last brave thing was a mistake. That's not yours to take back. It's mine to protect. Charles looked at him. You sound like her. Like who? Sarah. She used to talk like the words cost her something. Most folks throw 'em away free. The old man's eyes were wet and he didn't wipe them. All right, son, I'm in. Scared and in. Put it on my headstone if you have to. Robert drove home in the dark, with one more piece of the line secured, and a fresh weight on the other side of the scale. Because every person who agreed to stand with him became a person Gary Young could reach for. And the strength of a chain and the number of its breakable links are the same number. Monday was supposed to be Austin. It almost wasn't. Because Sunday night, late, the last and worst card came down, and it didn't come for Charles or Kevin or Lisa. It came for Emily. Robert's phone rang at 11:40, a number he didn't know. He almost let it go. He wished after that he had, except no, he'd needed to hear it. You can't fight a thing you won't look at, Mr. Williams. A voice he didn't recognize. Smooth. Bored, almost. We understand your late wife's sister has standing as a potential guardian. We understand. There are questions about a single father's fitness when he's chosen to involve his minor daughter in armed standoffs, saltos, with surveyors. Study a complicated thing in this state. Be ashamed to complicate it. The line went dead. Robert stood in his kitchen and did not move for a full minute because they'd found it. The one fault line. The one thing he was still afraid to lose. His phone never stopped ringings. He'd thought he had nothing left to threaten, and they'd reached past the dead and put their hand on the living, on a child with a brown braid asleep upstairs who'd taught a Dallas woman the difference between a knot that holds and a knot that fails. And for the first time since the brass gold morning by the fence, Robert Williams felt the cold come all the way through him. He sat down at the table where the deed binder and the brown envelope lay stacked. The weapons, the proof. Enough to end Gary Young, and not worth one hair on his daughter's head. He understood, in that kitchen, at midnight, exactly the trade Gary was offering. Drop it, sign, keep your girl. Or fight, and find out how long a 60-year-old widower's custody holds up against a man who can buy judges lunch for a decade. It was the smartest move Gary had made. It was also the one that lost him the war. Because Robert had been ready to be reasonable about the water was just money. But the moment they made his daughter a chip on the table, his phone never stopped ringing. Gary Young stopped being a business problem and became something older and simpler, a thing with a name in the Old Testament. And a man who has buried his wife and is told he might bury the right to raise their child, does not negotiate. He stops counting the cost. That's what Gary, for all his flaws and his fountain pen and his never-raised voice, had never understood about the men who own the ground he wanted. You can buy a man who's afraid. You cannot buy a man who's stopped being afraid because you took the last thing he had left to lose and showed him he'd lose it either way. Karen found him at the table at 1 a.m, drawn down by the light, in the boots she now wore to bed half the time without realizing. "Robert, what happened?" "Your face," he told her, plain. No softening. Because she'd earned plain, she sat down slow, and the thing that moved across her face this time wasn't fear, and it wasn't the old calculation. It was rage, clean and white, and finally pointed in the right direction. He threatened your daughter. Not a question. To stop a lawsuit. He threatened a 7-year-old. Yeah, she stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the dark pasture where a spring older than the state ran cold and clear underground. A Dallas firm had tried to cut in half. "I worked for that man for 4 years," she said, to the glass, to herself, to nobody. "I brought him deals. I closed his rooms. I used his words on people smaller than me because I thought that's what strength sounded like." She turned around. "Robert, I'll testify. Voluntarily. I'll resign. I'll turn over every internal document I've got. I'll stand up in a federal courtroom and tell them exactly what I signed, and exactly who told me not to read it. He thinks I'm a liability he can manage." Her voice didn't shake now. The shaking was done. "He's about to find out I'm the witness, who watched him do it from the chair on his right hand." Robert looked at her, across the kitchen. He'd asked her once what she meant to do with the water. She hadn't had an answer. She had one now. "You understand what that costs you," he said. "Your career. Your name. Friends you've had 20 years won't take your calls. You'll be the woman who burned her own house down. I built that house on a buried clause and a sentence I learned from a man who threatens children." She almost smiled. There was no humor in it and a great deal of freedom. Let it burn, and there it was. The line crossed. Not for money. Not even yet. For the man at the table or the child upstairs. Though those would come. For the simple, late, expensive reason that she had finally seen what she was, and decided at 38, in a kitchen, in a county she'd never heard of, to be something else. They didn't sleep. They sat up and they made a plan. The two of them, the deed binder opened between them and the brown envelope beside it, and Emily's small breathing, audible through the floorboards. Karen called Robert Rutt's lawyer in Austin at 2 a.m. Paul Moore answered on the 4th ring, fully awake, because lawyers who are any good sleep with the phone on the pillow. She introduced herself by her full title and watched Robert's eyebrows go up, because she said it like the title was a thing she was setting down rather than holding up. "Mr. Moore, I'm the chief executive of the company on the outside of this. As of about an hour from now, I'll be a cooperating witness instead. I have internal emails. I have my own signed copy of the appendix. And I have a transcript from 2019 that I think is going to ruin somebody's morning. A pause on the line. The sound of a man sitting up in the dark, Ms. Martinez. If even half of what you just said checks out, it checks out. Robert's bringing the deed history. Charles Davis will testify to the chain of the transcript, and there's a woman named Lisa Lopez whose son just lost his job over this, and I'd take it as a personal favor if your firm found a place for a sharp young associate who's about to need one. Robert looked at her. She shrugged. The smallest motion. He took something from her for helping you. We're going to put it back. That's how this works now. It was, Rob thought, watching her run his war from his own kitchen table in muddy boots and a feed store shirt. The strangest thing love had ever looked like. He didn't call it that. Not yet. The word was too big and too soon, and he'd only had it once before and earned it over 20 years. But he noticed he'd stopped setting out 1 cup in the morning. He'd started without deciding to. Setting out 3. Before dawn, Emily came down the stairs in her pajamas, rubbing one eye, drawn by the lights and the voices. She stopped at the bottom and looked at the two of them at the table. The papers, the half-empty coffee, the particular weather of grown-ups, who haven't slept. Are we in trouble? Karen got there, before Robert did. Crossed the kitchen and crouched down to the child's eye level, the way she'd done on the first day, with the glass of well water. Except this time, it didn't feel like a thing she was learning. It felt like a thing she'd always known and forgotten. No, sweetheart. We're getting out of trouble. There's a difference, you and Daddy, me and your daddy, and Mr. Davis. And Miss Lopez, she tucked a loose strand of the brown braid behind the girl's ear gently, the gesture of a woman surprised by her own hands again. A whole lot of people decided to do the right thing all at once, which doesn't happen very often. So we're going to make it count. Emily considered this with her usual gravity. Is the loud man going to be okay? Karen looked at the child, and she made a decision in that second about what kind of person she wanted Emily to remember her as. No, she said, honest, because the girl had handed her honesty first, days ago, wrapped in a napkin. He's going to face what he did. That's not the same as okay. But it's fair. And fair is better than okay, even when it's harder. Emily nodded like that made perfect sense, which, to a child it does. Before the world spends 30 years teaching you to confuse the two. Then she climbed into the chair between them, in her pajamas, at 5 in the morning, and reached for the corner of the deed binder, and turned it her way, and pretended to read the page about her great-great-great-grandfather, and a clerk, and a son that said in 1887, and the three of them sat there as the sky outside went from charcoal to peach. The war planned, the road to Austin waiting, the water still running cold and clear under all of it. Robert looked at the woman who'd called his father's tractor a parking lot. She was teaching his daughter to hold the binder right side up, and he understood that, whatever happened Monday, whatever it cost, whatever a man with a fountain and 43 floors tried to take, something had already crossed his fence and decided to stay. He didn't know yet if he'd let it. He only knew the gate was open, and he'd been the one to open it. They left for Austin a little after 6, with Emily safe at the Lopez place in town, where Lisa had promised pancakes and a slow morning brushing the neighbor's pony. Robert had not wanted to leave her anywhere. That was the new fear talking. The custody threat had moved into him overnight, like a tenant who wouldn't pay. And now every mile away from his daughter felt like a mile he'd have to answer for. But Lisa Lopez had met him at her door at 5:30 in a robe and a voice made of granite. Robert, they threatened my son, and I gave you my binder. You think I'd let one hair on that child come loose? She's safer with me than with the governor. So he'd left Emily eating cereal, and chattering at a pony through a fence. And he'd driven south with Karen Martinez beside him, and a leather briefcase wedged between them, the deep binder, and the brown envelope and a thicker folder of Karen's own materials inside. The whole war reduced to paper a man could carry under one arm. Somewhere south of the river they began to talk, not strategy. They'd talked strategy until 2 in the morning. This was the other thing. The thing 20 days of being a few miles apart had circled and never landed on. My father went broke twice, Karen said, watching a river run alongside the road. Once when I was 9, once when I was 15. He raised me on one sentence: never love anything that can't appreciate in value. She let that sit. He meant it as kindness. He thought he was handing me armor, and I wore it for 30 years and called it ambition. Robert kept his eyes on the road. My wife wrote her senior thesis on Saddleback Springs, range ecology, fall of '86. That's how we met. I was a sophomore. She was a senior. She asked me if I knew anything about my own water, and I said no. And she said, well, that's a shame. A small thing happened at the corner of his mouth, and I said, maybe you could teach me. Karen smiled at the windshield. The first smile of the trip that wasn't caught trying to close anything. She'd have liked you, Robert said. Not at first. You'd have rubbed her wrong for about a week, and then she'd have decided you were worth the trouble, and there'd been no getting rid of you after that. Karen laughed, soft, and then her face did something complicated. That's the nicest threat anyone's ever made me, because it was a threat. No getting rid of you. And she heard, underneath it, the thing neither of them was saying, the thing in the cab since the word we at the cattle guard, growing now in the dark of a truck, doing 70 past a river that didn't care. Paul Moore was waiting in his office on the 18th floor of a stone-faced building 2 blocks off Congress Avenue. Sleeves already rolled. He read the brown envelope without speaking. 90 seconds. Karen counted them out of old habit and then made herself stop. He set it down. On the blotter. Robert, this is enough. This is more than enough. He looked up. With Ms. Martinez corroborating, this isn't a property dispute anymore. This is a federal conspiracy file with a Texas Land Office official's seal on it. We file this week. Karen cleared her throat. Mr. Moore, if I resign from the company tonight, in writing, and turn over my internal documents as a cooperating witness instead of being subpoenaed as a defendant, can we file Tuesday morning instead of Wednesday? Paul looked at Robert. Robert looked at Karen. Karen looked at the bookshelf behind Paul's head and did not turn away from it, because turning away was the city reflex. And she'd burned that out somewhere on a dirt road 2 weeks back. Why does a day matter? Paul asked. Because every day Gary Young has, he spends, and what he's spending it on now is a custody threat against a 7-year-old and a phone campaign to shut down a feed store run by a 78-year-old man. I want his lawyers reading our complaint Tuesday morning, instead of planning their next call Tuesday morning. I want him on defense before he wakes up. Paul Moore looked at this woman in muddy boots who'd run a $500 million pipeline 3 weeks ago and was now offering to set fire to her own life on a Tuesday to save a child she'd met 11 days prior. Tuesday morning, he said. That night, they took separate rooms on the 8th floor of a hotel on West 6th Street. At 10, Robert knocked on the door of 812. When Karen opened it, he held out a bottle. Green glass. Hand-corked. Condensation already beating on the outside. Helps you sleep. Sarah used to swear by it. She took it, held it in both hands. Robert, why are you doing this with me? You had the envelope. You had the deed history. You could have filed without me and kept your name out of every part of it that's going to get ugly. He was a man who thought about things before he said them, which she'd learned was rarer than money. Because you turned around, that's not an answer, it's the only one there is. Most people don't. They get halfway down a road, and the road gets hard, and they tell themselves a story about why turning back is the smart move. You got to the gate at 1 in the morning with your keys in the ignition and the smart move idling under your hand. And you turned the engine off. He stepped back. A man can build a lot on somebody who turns around, Miss Martinez. Not much on anybody who doesn't. He closed the door. She stood in the middle of the room with the bottle in both hands for nearly a minute. Then she poured a glass, drank it, slow, sitting on the edge of the bed, and she did not check her phone. And she did not open her laptop. And when the glass was empty, she lay down on top of the comforter, fully dressed, and slept the whole night through for the first time in longer than she could measure. In Dallas, Gary Young was on his fourth call to her phone. None of them answered. He set the phone down on a desk the size of a kitchen table and turned to the man on the other line, the head of his security firm, and his voice for the first time in a long time had a hairline crack in the silk. Find her, because Gary Young had spent 30 years learning exactly one lesson and learning it too well. That every person has a price, and the only mistake you can make is failing to find it. He'd offered Karen a price 4 years ago and she'd taken it. He'd offered Robert a price and assumed the man simply hadn't heard the right number yet. He offered Lisa Lopez a price written in her son's career and watched it work. And it had never once occurred to him, on any of his floors, that a person might reach a point where the thing you threaten becomes the thing that frees them. That you can take a man's fear away by taking everything he was afraid of. That a woman never stopped ringing. That a woman might look at a buried clause with her own signature on it and decide the only way left to respect herself was to detonate it. He didn't understand any of that. His phone never stopped ringing. So he sat in the dark at the top of his building and made a fifth call that didn't answer. And somewhere south of him, the people he'd tried to buy were sleeping like the dead because their consciences were finally clean. At 7 the next morning, Karen knocked on the door of 810. She wore the same blazer as the day before. She held the empty water bottle by the neck because she hadn't been able to leave it in the room, and she wasn't sure why, and she'd stopped that week, needing to be sure why about everything. I'm ready. The clerk's office of the Travis County Civil District Court opened at 9. Paul Moore was the first attorney through the door. He filed 3 documents at once. The first was a civil complaint on behalf of Robert A. Williams and Williams Cattle Co. against Brant Keller Land Holdings, against the chairman of its board, Gary Young, individually, and against a list of 17 co-defendants, alleging conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted abuse of eminent domain proceedings, and willful violation of Texas surface and groundwater law. The second was Karen Martinez's sworn affidavit as a cooperating witness. The third was a sealed packet of internal company emails, proving Gary Young had personally drafted the buried diversion clause, knowing precisely what it would do to the spring and how long it would take. The filings were public by 10. By noon, the Dallas Business Press had it. The same reporter who'd called Karen's cell, now writing a very different story than the one he'd been fed. And then the thing Karen had warned them about happened. The thing that made her testimony matter more than the documents. Gary Young did not fold. He had money to lose for years and not feel it. She'd said that. She'd been right. His phone never stopped ringing. His firm had issued a statement calling Karen Martinez a disgruntled former executive whose performance had been under review, whose claims were the predictable retaliation of a woman about to be terminated, whose so-called transcript was an unauthenticated photocopy with no chain of custody. That last one landed, because it was, technically, true a photocopy from a feed store safe given to Charles by a nephew who was dead, the original gone from the state archive. A defense attorney could spend a year alone on whether the document was even admissible. The press wobbled. The story softened. The headline that ran Wednesday morning had a question mark in it, and a question mark is where momentum goes to die. And in a hotel room on West 6th, Karen Martinez sat on the floor, with her back against the bed, and felt the old cold certainty rise up in her, the voice that sounded like her father. "I told you, feelings don't pay. You torched your career for a photocopy." Robert knocked. She let him in without getting up off the floor. "It's slipping," she said. "He's going to make it a he said, she said, and outspend us until everyone's bored. The transcript's not enough on its own. We need the chain. We need to prove that paper is real. And the only man who can is 78 and scared." Robert finished. "I know. They'll eat him alive on cross. They'll make a confused old grocer out of a man who's smarter than every lawyer in that room, and they'll do it in front of his whole town." Robert sat down on the floor beside her. A 60-year-old man, lowering himself to the carpet, joints announcing it. "Then we don't make him do it alone." So they drove back to Cedar Hollow, and they sat with Charles Davis in the apartment above his store, and Charles, who'd waited 7 years to hand the envelope to the right person, listened to what cross-examination would do to him, and went pale, and then went still, and then did the bravest thing anyone in the whole business did. He went and got the rest of it, because the photocopy was never all of it. His nephew, dying, careful, a state employee who'd spent his last clear months making sure the truth would survive him, hadn't it just copied the transcript. He'd kept a contemporaneous log, dated, initialed, a government worker's habit, the boring diary of who handled what file, when, and in that log was the entry recording the day. The original transcript was checked out by an aide to a man whose name was now on a federal complaint, and never logged back in. The photocopy was the crime. The log was the chain. Charles had kept them in separate places, the way you keep two halves of a thing that's only dangerous together. And he'd never told a soul about the second half, because telling was how things got taken. He laid the log on the table beside the envelope. "I held this back," he said. His voice was steady again, the granite returned. "Not 'cause I didn't trust you, 'cause I'm 78, and an old man's got to keep one card he hasn't shown, or the world stops needing him to wake up." He looked at Robert. "Reckon I don't need it anymore. Reckon I'd rather be needed all at once than parceled out, careful for the rest of a short life." Paul Moore drove out from Austin that night to take it into evidence himself, and the chain held. It took weeks, not hours. Karen had warned them of that too. The story didn't break Gary Young in an afternoon, the way stories do in the movies that men like Gary commission about themselves. It broke him in stages, the way a dam breaks, a seep and then a crack, and then the whole face of it, letting go at once. The authenticated log forced the document into evidence. The document forced the federal interest. The federal interest forced the board to look at its own exposure. And a board will protect itself long after it's stopped protecting any individual man. And on a Thursday 3 weeks after the filing, Brandt Keller's stock had shed 41% of its value, and the board convened an emergency session. They voted 7-1 to remove Gary Young as chairman. Effective, immediately, Gary cast the one dissenting vote. Against himself. It was, the lone reporter wrote, the only honest thing the man had done in the entire affair. Voting, with full sincerity, that Gary Young should remain in charge of Gary Young's company, outnumbered 7-1 by people who'd finally done the math. The Dallas field office of the FBI opened a formal fraud and conspiracy file the same afternoon, and the eminent domain contingency from 2019. The plan to take the land by force, if it couldn't be bought by trick, became the centerpiece of an investigation that would not be finished for years, would reach a deputy commissioner's office, would end careers that had nothing to do with a spring or a fence or a man on a tractor, the way a single rotten beam once found, makes the inspector wonder about the whole house. Karen testified. She didn't enjoy it. She'd thought, in some buried place, that there'd be satisfaction in it. There wasn't. There was only the long, flat, exhausting work of telling the truth slowly, under oath, while a defense attorney tried 16 ways to make her say she'd known all along. She hadn't known all along. That was the worst of it, and the truest. She'd signed a clause she didn't read because a man she trusted told her not to bother. And on the stand she said exactly that. No prettier, no uglier, I was careless. And they engineered my carelessness. And both of those things are true, and I won't pretend only the convenient one. The jury believed her precise because she didn't try to make herself the hero of it. Charles testified too. He wore his old Stetson and a tie his wife had picked out for him 40 years before. He answered questions in short, plain sentences. When the defense lawyer leaned in and asked, with a smile, how a man his age could be certain his memory of 2019 was reliable, Charles looked at him for a long moment. Son, I've run a feed store 46 years on credit I extend by memory and trust I keep in my head. I know to the dollar what every rancher in this county owes me and what every one of 'em is good for. My body's failing. My memory's the last thing that will. A beat. And I remember exactly the day 2 men in better suits than yours tried to make me feel small for being old. You're the third! The gallery laughed. The judge didn't gavel it down right away. When Charles stepped down, Robert was waiting in the hallway. Charles put a hand on his shoulder, the fine tremor in it now, steadied as always by Will. Sarah would have been proud, son. Robert nodded. He couldn't get a single word out. Kevin Perez got a job at Paul Moore's firm in Austin. A good one. Out of Gary Young's reach forever, working for the man who'd helped take Gary down, which Lisa Lopez found a kind of justice, almost too clean to be real. She finally opened the leather binder all the way. Behind the deed history, behind 130 years of names and water and ink, there was a single folded sheet of cream stationery she'd never had cause to reach. Sarah's handwriting. A codicil. Written 6 months before the accident. Lisa drove out to the Williams place on a Friday evening and put it in Robert's hands without a word. Because some things a lawyer doesn't read first. Even when the law says she may, Robert sat at the kitchen table to read it. There was a line in it he had never seen. If I'm not there, Robert, find someone who can stand on this land without trying to own it. He read it twice. Then he folded it along Sarah's crease and put it in the pocket of his flannel, the inside pocket where the memo had written once, and a card he still hadn't read, and he walked out onto the porch into the December cold. Karen was sitting on the top step. Emily was beside her, and Karen was teaching her, or trying to, and getting it wrong, and being corrected by a 7-year-old. How to find the first stars of winter. That one's not a star, Miss Karen. That's a planet. How can you possibly tell? It doesn't twinkle. Stars twinkle. Planets just sit there being bright. Daddy taught me. Your daddy, Karen said, taught you a lot of things, didn't he? He says you can't learn the sky in a hurry. You gotta look at it the same hour every night for a long time and let it teach you slow. Robert stood in the doorway with Sarah's last instruction folded against his chest, listening to his daughter explain his dead wife's whole philosophy to a woman who'd arrived 11 weeks ago, calling his life a parking lot. Canine someone who can stand on this land without trying to own it. He hadn't gone looking. He wanted that on the record, in his own heart, for honesty's sake. He hadn't gone looking for anyone, ever, after Sarah. He'd made his peace with the cold half of the bed and the single cup. But the woman on his porch step had stood on his land for 3 months now. And she'd stopped trying to own it the moment she found out what it was worth. That, he thought, was the part Sarah would have wanted him to notice. Not that Karen had nothing, that she'd had everything, and let it go. and stayed. By the first week of December, the case had moved past the headlines and into the slow machinery of the courts, and the immediate war was won, even if the long one would grind on for years. Willow Bend was acquired, not by the consortium, not by any shell entity, but by a new nonprofit Karen Martinez had chartered under Texas law with her own name nowhere in its title, the Saddleback Land Trust, founded to protect family ranches from corporate acquisition and aquifer draining development. Initial capital, $40 million. Drawn from her whistleblower award, her personal savings, and the liquidation of her Dallas penthouse, which she sold furnished, to a stranger, without going back to walk through it one last time. She'd considered for exactly one bad night the other offer, because the board, the same board that fired Gary, had called her, with the receiver still warm. They wanted her for interim chairman. They were doubling her base. They wanted the woman who'd survived the scandal to walk the company through the cleanup and out the other side. And there is a particular intoxication to being asked to rule the kingdom you helped burn. She'd sat with it, in the cabin behind the main house where she'd been staying, in the cold alone. And the old voice had made its last and best case. This is everything you wanted. Power, and your name cleared, and a decade of work that matters. His phone never stopped ringing. You can do more good from the top of that tower than from a porch in a town with one diner. It was a good argument. It was the most dangerous argument she'd ever heard, because it was true enough to act on. She'd called Robert at midnight, not for permission. She didn't need permission anymore. That was the whole point of what she'd become. She'd called him because she wanted to say the thing out loud to someone who wouldn't tell her what she wanted to hear. They offered me the chair. A pause on the line. I figured they would. It's twice the money. It's my name back. It's 10 years of undoing what he built. And I keep thinking, do I want to spend 10 years undoing what Gary built? Or do I want to spend them building something he'd never have understood in the first place? His phone never stopped ringing. Robert didn't answer for a moment. When he did, he gave her the only thing he'd ever given her that she'd asked for, and the only thing he'd never once tried to sell. That's not a question I get to answer for you. That's the whole reason it's worth asking. It's the whole reason it's worth asking. She declined the chair the second Monday in December, and she found the trustees instead. And when people in Dallas said she'd lost her mind, she found she didn't have an opinion about what they said, which was the strangest and most peaceful discovery of the whole year. That she had finally stopped grading herself on a curve set by people whose approval had never once made her sleep through the night. The spring received a state-level protective designation. No diversion would ever be drilled. His bench never springing. The Metropolitan Water contract, the $400 million engine that had started all of it, was reassigned to a desalinationist project on the Gulf Coast, where the water came from the sea instead of from under a widower's pasture, which was where it should have come from all along. Which, if anyone in a tower had bothered to ask the land instead of the spreadsheet. Gary Young was indicted on the 23rd of October, remanded to home confinement pending trial. The shell entity he'd built collapsed inside a week. The 43-floor office got leased to an insurance company, and the man who'd spent 30 years certain that everyone had a price spent his evenings in an ankle monitor, in a house he could no longer afford to keep heated. Having phone never the one thing, his ion thing his entire philosophy had no line item for. People who stopped being afraid. Karen moved out of the cabin the second week of December and into a small rented house on the south end of Cedar Hollow, close to the Williams place. Not on it. The house had a yellow door and a porch that faced east. And she liked it, and she wasn't ready yet for what lay in the distance between the cabin and the main house, that short stretch of ground that a person can't cross until they're sure they won't be crossing it to own anything. Robert understood. He didn't ask when she came for supper on Wednesdays. He simply set a third plate, the way he'd been setting it, the way he'd been since a night in his kitchen, with a deed binder open and a child between them, and neither of them remarked on how easily 3 places fit on a table that had held one for 4 years. A few days before Christmas, Robert walked the fence line between his land and Willow Bend, with a coil of new wire over one shoulder and a post driver in his hand. The sky was the high cold blue that only comes in Texas in December, the blue that looks like it would ring if you struck it. It was the same stretch of fence, the exact stretch, where a woman in city heels and a tailored blazer had stood 3 months earlier and called his pasture a future parking lot, in a voice trained to take up the whole room. She came down the dirt road on foot, in her boots, the ones with real mud worked permanently into the seams now, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the Dusty Bell. The bad honest coffee, which she'd developed a taste for the way you develop a taste for a place that has decided to keep you. She handed him one. They worked without speaking for almost an hour. She held the wire taut against the cedar posts, while he drove them deeper into the caliche. Her hands had calluses now, small ones, earned on the fleshy part of her thumbs, and she'd stopped noticing them, which was its own point of arrival. When the last post was set, they straightened up together and looked west across the pasture, toward the rise where the water ran cold and clear, and older than the state of Texas. Robert, I don't know what this is yet. He set the post driver down. He looked at her, a long moment the way a man looks at a horizon he's trying to read for weather. Doesn't have to be anything yet. Land doesn't rush, neither do I. I had one good thing in my life, and it took 20 years to grow into what it was. I'm in no hurry to mistake a feeling for a thing already finished. She nodded once. She didn't look away. A small thudding of boots came up behind them. Emily, leading Biscuit by the halter, braids swinging, cheeks pink from the cold, never stopped a tear, walking with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided something the adults are still being slow about. She walked straight between them. She slipped her right hand into Karen's left. She slipped her left hand into Robert's right, and she turned the 3 of them, gently, with the unanswerable authority of the young, to face the spring. The water was still moving. It had always been moving. It would keep moving long after all 3 of them, and after the fence, and after the wire, and after whatever names anyone ever wrote on any deed in any office, in any county on earth. His phone never stopped. Robert felt his daughter's small fingers tight around his own. He felt on Emily's other side, the woman who had stood on this same line in October and tried to take it from him, now standing on it with him, in the same boots she'd worn into the mud, in the same cold, looking at the same water she'd once called a parking lot. Sarah had written, "Find someone who can stand on this land without trying to own it." He looked at Karen Martinez, who had liquidated a penthouse to protect a spring she'd never drink dry, who had set fire to her own name to keep a man's word from being broken, who held his daughter's hand like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever been trusted with, because it was. He did not let go. Neither did Karen, and the 3 of them stood at the fence in the ringing blue cold, while the water that had outlasted empires kept on about its ancient business, indifferent to fortunes and lawsuits and the sick and the slow brave work of a heart deciding, at 60, to open the gate one more time. Some fences mark where a man's land ends. Others mark where his life begins again.